We think differently.
Fine. How is Tokyo?
Great. It was a beautiful day today. When the weather is nice in autumn in Tokyo, nowhere in the world is nicer.
I can imagine. We have also in
On
Vienna.
the whole, we've had a year of very bad weather, so
Yes.
it's unusual to have a nice day.
Yeah, so it's with the sunny. So today in Vienna, because I'm in Vienna, so it's also sunny. It's a nice day, exceptionally nice as the autumn comes.
Well, listen, I'm so sorry about the recent worrying developments in Vienna.
Yes.
I'm glad it was contained very quickly.
It was a shock because in Austria the last terrorist attack was taking place with the Palestinians. I think it was already 40 years ago, and
unfortunately it can happen anywhere, anytime. That's the reality of small-scale terrorism that can do very significant damage.
True. So practically here, nearly nobody in the living memory has it. So that was a bit of a shock. So, I mean, generations and generations were not there, you know. So when the Palestinians, I think it was a hostage crisis in OPEC, if I'm not mistaken. That was the last one.
Good.
So it was related to that. And they had demands, if I'm not mistaken. They had a couple of documentaries, but definitely 40 years ago. So it was practically no event.
Does your class usually take place, or this group usually take place in English, or what alternative language is used?
There are classes in both, in French and German, because it's the campus. So the organizers are in Geneva.
Yes.
So the school is in Geneva, and I travel when I'm myself teaching, so I travel there physically in normal times. I'm not conducting classes via Zoom, but now, of course, with Corona, is different. So they are classes that are French and English.
Terrific.
So it's offered because anyway, Geneva is French, and then there are a lot of students whose French is either mother tongue or let's say next to the mother tongue level. So that's it. I think we can start since you are leaving. I was waiting for Rector, but maybe we can already start, and then he can say a couple of words in the end, not to waste time, because I see it's 11. So it's my good morning, everyone, and good day to Excellency in Tokyo. It's my great pleasure that we have a second event. It happened to be another Canadian national, but in this case, it's a reputable senior official who serves for United Nations. And for you, I'm sure that many of you didn't know quite well that UN has its own university, which has been established as one of the functioning bodies very early into the development of United Nations, and for that purpose. And so we have a great pleasure of today having an excellency who is a rector of university, and at the same time, Undersecretary General of United Nations. So floor is yours, Excellency, because we know that you have to leave in about 55 minutes or so around midday. Local Central European time, you have to leave.
Indeed.
So please.
And I apologize for that.
No, it's okay. It's absolutely okay. We know that you have very busy schedule, and we appreciate very much your time and your devotion to be with us today afternoon in Tokyo and late morning here in Europe, in Geneva and in Vienna. So floor is yours, please.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be with you all today. I apologize for having to cut out a bit early. The reason is tomorrow, the collective leadership of the UN gets together, the heads of the larger agencies. and some of the key Secretariat colleagues around the Secretary General and the heads of the IMF, World Bank, WTO, and so on, join us. And it requires a bit of preparation, some of which I'm involved in. So that's the reason why my time is constrained this week. But I've been looking forward to this, and all praise to Anis because he was very entrepreneurial in reaching out to me. My topic is development, international development, economic development, as it's sometimes interchangeably called. The reason I like raising it is there are so many different conceptions of what international development is and where it came from. And what I'm going to offer you today is a very personal interpretation. It's not the gospel truth. It's simply my personal interpretation of what was important in the emergence of this issue during the late 1950s, early 1960s, as a major issue, particularly in international organizations and for newly decolonized countries, and what has been the trajectory, both in terms of content and key ideas since then, and where we are today. And I hope to leave plenty of time for your own comments, any questions you might have, and then I'll have to leave you at 5 before the hour. And again, I apologize for that. So probably all of you know that today's concept of international development is quite recent. It wasn't a major issue for the League of Nations at all. Decolonization was somewhat on the agenda for the League of Nations, but not in any, how can I say, not in any very convincing way. And no territories were willingly decolonized during the years of the League of Nations. The beginning of decolonization, which is the beginning of thinking about development of formerly colonized countries and regions, came in the thinking of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who I think on the one hand had a wife who was a great human rights activist, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the main force behind the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She didn't write it. It's because of her that the Declaration was adopted in 1948, but also because America had always resented advantage, the artificial advantage that colonial empires gave to European economic rivals. Americans thought it was competition. And so once they were in the driver's seat, which they were as of 1941, when they joined the Second World War effort, decolonization for them became not just a moral principle, but actually an item of self-interest in terms of its own international economic agenda. And that was a force that neither France or Britain, as the two then biggest colonial powers, had to reckon with before. And because the United States, their own salvation during the Second World War hinged so heavily on the United States, they weren't in a position to argue. Roosevelt and Churchill, probably Churchill rather reluctantly, first started hinting at a very different world order after the war in the Atlantic Charter, which was first in an early formulation in 1940. And then in 1941, Churchill and Roosevelt more routinely started talking of a United Nations or the United Nations, which were the opponents of the Axis powers. And the UN was created not as open to all. It's important to remember that when the UN was created, the defeated powers of the Second World War, Japan, Germany, and Italy, were not allowed to join until the mid-50s. So that's a bit of history that isn't directly relevant to development, but it's very important to understand how seismic the changes that Franklin Delano Roosevelt advanced, championed, and imposed ultimately were, such that even though he was dead by the time of the San Francisco Conference creating the UN, the World Bank system, the International the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, as it was initially called, focused on post-war reconstruction, by the way, not on international development as we think of it today. And the International Monetary Fund had already been created in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference. So for Roosevelt, the mistakes of the Versailles Conference and treaty were to be avoided. That the peace was not to be a vengeful peace against the defeated powers. Efforts would be made to help the defeated powers as well as the Allied powers reconstruct themselves. And that was the primary role of what we think of as the World Bank today when it was created. The IMF was simply about monetary stability. In the beginning, it had nothing to do with international development as we think of it today. And the mandates, the interpretation of the mandates of those institutions, just as the interpretation of the mandate of the UN, evolved considerably as a result of decolonization. That was the single most important process resulting from the Second World War, I would argue, that was a positive outcome of the Second World War, decolonization. It was reluctant and resisted to some degree, not so much by Britain, but by France, which fought 2 wars against decolonization, one in Vietnam, one in Algeria. It lost both. And being a country of realists, ultimately, the French rallied to the creed of decolonization. The British more willingly, largely because Churchill was thrown out of power in 1945, much to his own surprise, and a very reformist Labour Party came in, and it had championed decolonization. And by the time Churchill became prime minister again, it was already well on the way. So decolonization is at the root of what we think of today as international development. How did programming on development start? Well, in many ways, it started in the first countries to be decolonized after the war. And those countries were India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka in 1947 and 1948, respectively. And the first sizable development program that we would think of in a developing country was the Colombo Plan that emerged around 1950. It emerged in several stages. And it was a program of food aid to countries that were starving or nearly starving, and it was about agricultural development, how agricultural development of these countries could be assisted so that starvation would never again be a risk in the countries. India had suffered a famine during the Second World War, claimed somewhere between 1 and 3 million lives. It was quite an unnecessary famine. It was a famine of the absent-mindedness of the colonialists. They were busy fighting their European war and forgot all about India and its needs. They used the Indian army to win the Second World War, but neglected India itself during the Second World War. And that was typical of colonialist governments. The countries themselves didn't matter at all. It was the rents that could be extracted from the countries and the armed forces, in the case of India, that could be extracted from India that mattered to London. So the evils of colonialism are not studied enough today in schools or in universities for that matter. Often it's just an episode, but actually the end of colonialism was decisive for the developing world gaining a majority voice in the United Nations. The developing world in 1945 was individual countries like Iran, Siam, today's Thailand, Latin American countries. Most of Latin America had managed to decolonize itself during the 19th century, but the Caribbean was still thoroughly colonized, except for Cuba. And so this was a huge step. And with voice, the newly developing countries started saying, well, you know, international security may matter to you, but much more important to us is the eradication of extreme poverty in our countries. Security is a luxury for us. For you, it may be nice. And that's the shape of the debate that started up at the UN as I'd say about 1958, when mass decolonization started. Malaysia gained, it was Malaya then, gained independence in 1957. So did Ghana. And then there was a huge wave of decolonization until 1965. And that produced about 75, 80 countries that were new countries in the UN. And those countries were the majority, actually. So they had voice. And this voice was used mostly to advocate rights, their rights, and the need for economic development and the need for economic assistance to achieve development. I mentioned that the first fairly large-scale aid program was the Colombo Plan. What was the UN, what were the World Bank up to in the 1950s in the developing world? A set of activities known as technical cooperation. These were experimental, really interesting experimental programs. There wasn't much money for them, but what they were very exciting on-the-ground experiments. What works, what doesn't. Often carried off with $100,000 or $10,000, sums we would consider today you couldn't do anything with. The early pioneers of what we think of as international development today, often local people working with international experts, were able to, by trial and error, prove that development programming in all sorts of fields, education, public health, agriculture, industrialization up to a point, family planning, all of these things, was it could work with more money. And then the pressure was, well, we've experimented enough. Now we need a quantum leap in the quantities of money available for economic development in the developing world. And the World Bank started transitioning during the 1950s, reconstruction having been not totally achieved in Europe and in Japan, but being well on the way to being achieved. The World Bank reinvented itself, not as the Bank for Reconstruction, but the Bank for Development. It was a program of survival for the World Bank to have a new mandate and a nearly infinite mandate, a mandate that could keep them going forever. Because one reality is that organizations struggle to survive. And even when their mandate expires, they still struggle to survive by inventing a new mandate and somehow getting it agreed to by the decision-making powers. So by the 1960s, the scale of development programming was ramping up, but the ambition of developing countries was ramping up even quicker, such that what international organizations could do for them was inadequate, not up to the challenge, although helpful. And they sought bilateral help from individual governments of richer countries. And they also started borrowing. And that borrowing accelerated. And while development programs continued to be a mix of success and failure in the 60s, 70s, and 80s on a much larger scale, the first wave, which was in the 50s, started by Mr. Nehru in India and some other countries under his influence, was a wave of heavy industrialization. This didn't work well, partly because there was insufficient infrastructure in countries like India to get, say, the product, the inputs for a steel plant that wasn't actually in a port city, to get the inputs to the plant and to get the finished products from the plant to market. That infrastructure didn't exist. So many of these plants paid for by the United States or the USSR or the World Bank or regional development banks, they wound up being fiascos because they couldn't connect to anything. So that was an early lesson that wildcat industrialization was not the way to go. But meanwhile, developing countries had indebted themselves quite a bit, experimenting with, very ambitious industrialization. Such that the next thing I wanted to mention to you was a debt crisis that emerged in the 1980s. Developing countries could no longer service their debts. They could no longer repay the principal, and they couldn't even pay interest on the principal anymore because they had accumulated too much debt. A lot of it had gone to development. Other portions of it and the proportions of what varied from country to country, but some portion of it was often corruptly siphoned off by governing classes. And so developing countries were by and large, and that's true in each major continent, developing continent, Latin America and the Caribbean, Africa and Asia, in varying types of financial difficulty and simply incapable of repaying all this debt. Interestingly, Western governments for whom this was a bad surprise, and the international banking system for whom it was a worse surprise, after the initial shock of saying, well, we don't care, it has to be repaid, then recalibrated, dealt with reality, organized themselves into two groups. One, the group of official donors, countries and institutions of which the shareholders were governments, and separately, private creditors, so companies. The official creditors got together in something known as the Paris Club, and the private creditors got together in the London Club. And each of them, but actually communicating a lot with each other, started talking about, well, how can we address this crisis so as to make it manageable in the future for us and for the developing countries? And the response was a mix of two instruments. One was outright debt forgiveness. The private donors, creditors were very resistant to the idea of outright forgiveness. They had very little experience of outright forgiveness, except through processes of bankruptcy, and none of the developing countries wanted to declare themselves bankrupt. So that was for the private creditors difficult. For the public creditors, it was easier because, as you know, governments can print money. They can create money. And so the creditor governments found ways through the IMF and the World Bank of vastly expanding their resources without it costing their own taxpayers anything at the time. It was creative financial engineering. It's worth studying. It's very complicated. I was involved. I lived through it, but it was an incredible, brought about by crisis, as was the creation of all these international organizations. It was an incredible feat of financial entrepreneurship and engineering. The result was that a lot of debt was forgiven. A great deal of debt was rescheduled, and rescheduled in a way that made it possible for the banks to say to their auditors, well, it's still, it's an active asset. You can't declare it a dead asset. It may not be being repaid as quickly as you might like, the auditors, or we might like, but it's still on the books. So you can't say that it's a dead asset. And so this was managed that way, very creatively. It took about 10 years to happen between the beginning of the crisis, all these arrangements being put in place. But it worked, and by 1995, developing countries were pulling out of the debt crisis, and in industrialized capitals, governments were more relaxed about this. What happened then was that, in a way, both sides needed a new project in development and needed to get away from the politics of mutual blame, which was, in a way, the dynamic of debates at the UN on development, which had turned into, you, the colonists, are responsible for our plight, you pay, and the industrialized countries saying, well, sorry, you mismanage, it's your own problem, and meanwhile, it's our money, so kindly be a bit more polite. And that led, of course, nowhere. So, but you can imagine how much everybody enjoyed that. So by 1995, everybody wanted to get away from that dynamic. And the dynamic was not so different in the World Bank and the IMF, except that in the IMF and the Bank, the rich countries had all the voting power anyway. So the developing countries were never able to have the equivalent weight they had in the UN. So the developing countries themselves were very open to finding a new basis for thinking about development and development programming. And that was the origins of the Millennium Development Goals, which materialized as a result of a summit in the year 2000. The goals themselves only materialized through an obscure process in the office of Kofi Annan. Turned out to be a very productive process, I should add, proposing a very limited number of goals and targets, but they were very ambitious. So if you go back and look at the Millennium Development Goals, you'll see that they were narrow, they were ambitious, and lo and behold, they were achieved mostly. Not all of them were achieved, not all of the targets were met, but the vast majority were met. How come they were met? Because everything had not worked before. Very interesting story. As a result of debt rescheduling and so on, developing countries achieved their highest levels of growth historically between the year 2000 and the year 2015. And those were the years of the Millennium Development Goals. So all of a sudden, developing countries had money to invest in achieving the goals because they had tax revenue coming in. They were excellent places to invest money in. So all sorts of international capital was flowing to them again. And so those 15 years were anni mirabili in a way for the developing world, which allowed the Millennium Development Goals to be achieved. And that led on to a debate at the UN about a different type of goal to take over from the Millennium Development Goals. It styled itself as wanting to be more ambitious, wanting to achieve even more, understandable and attractive in terms of the publics, but it led to a very ambitious package, which was counting on those high levels of growth continuing in developing countries and also in industrialized countries. But as a result of the 2008 financial crisis in the West and some other countries, growth slowed in the industrialized world on average, and growth also slowed for reasons that aren't yet entirely clear in developing countries. And so the Millennium Development Goals, much more ambitious yet, coincided even before coronavirus with a secular slowdown in much of the developing world. The continent that was a bit of an exception to that was Asia, but the two great engines of growth in Asia, China and India, both did slow down after 2015, interestingly. Both of them lost 2 to 3% of the growth they'd been able to achieve before for reasons that aren't fully understood yet. Often in economic studies, the cause of certain phenomena becomes clear only over la longue durée, the French would say, and a great deal of study by all sorts of disciplines in the university world and elsewhere. I'm going to stop there because I did want to have a dialogue with as many of you as possible. I just thought I'd try to communicate why I, now quite long in the tooth, I'm delighted that my life coincided with the movement to create genuine development in countries that had been ultra poor when I was a boy, one of which I lived in when I was a boy, and that the outcome, while unsatisfactory, is still so immensely better than where we started in 1958, that for somebody like me, it's been quite an exciting run with dramatic ups and downs as we went along, good ideas, bad ideas, successes and failures.
Thank you, Excellency. It's actually a brilliant overview. It's very, let's say, compressed but content-rich. I've been teaching international law, although you talked also about development for years. I have over thousands of hours of teaching, but still, I never managed to put it so compact and so content-rich, but still in a very nice and positive, in a light way. I think you touched so many things, and I'm particularly grateful that you also touched upon the history and the philosophy behind, because many people are not grasping, you know, why United Nations and why this composition that we have, and the four policemen concept and the concept of nations that are united all together. So many things, and then of course the arrival of the newly liberated countries that also created, because you mentioned the late 50s and mid 60s. So there was not far away from Tokyo, there was also a big conference in 56 in Bandung, which tried to connect, actually to engage South-South cooperation and dialogue for the first time on the planetary scale. So there were a lot of dynamics, and then the non-aligned movement and the formation of G77 and many other things. So essentially, and also the right for development and different directions of this development, linking with the trade, and also creation of UNCTAD as a part of this ongoing debate.
1964, yeah.
As you mentioned, so this is never ending actually debate, because it's not easy to conduct something for the mankind with so many discrepancies and differences, and to get the precise answer. I remember a colleague of mine, and then I stopped, who is teaching economics, and when we have exams, he said, okay, so Alice, the questions are always the same, but the answers are changing every 5 years. So what I gave the excellent grade today to student 4, it could be a failing grade in 5 years' time. So that's also with the economy. So our thoughts are different. I have so many questions. So practically, where did we lose the momentum? So UN was really at the front of everything. There was so much enthusiasm, and the feeling even before Corona is that planet went on some sort of on pilot control. So there is autopilot that is running the planet. Somehow we lost UN. Who lost the UN?
Well, I'd say, coming back to the development issue, I mentioned the debt crisis, but I didn't mention the World Bank and the IMF's response to the debt crisis. Starting in the early 1980s, which came to be known under the umbrella term structural adjustment. And you just have to tighten your belt, was the translation of structural adjustment. Yes. You have to squeeze yourselves until you can pay. And looking back, that was remarkably foolish, because the countries simply didn't have the means to squeeze their belts in a productive way. They did so somewhat because there was no alternative, but of course it produced no positive result, tightening the belt. And then, in order to resolve the debt crisis, the UN played no role in that, honestly. You know, UNCTAD people in UNCTAD were giving their own, they had their own work program, doing excellent work on investment, by the way. But what they had to say about development at the time, if you go back to it, bore very little resemblance to the action that was actually taken to resolve the crisis. And the debates at the UN itself, in the Second Committee of the General Assembly, took on an air of unreality, where it was like two ships passing in the night, even recognizing each other. On one hand, the group of 77, which was actually a group of about 135 developing countries and other countries. There wasn't much effective communication. The action was elsewhere. The action came back to the UN with the formulation of the goals, which the Bank and the Fund enthusiastically endorsed, because they wanted to get out from under the opprobrium of structural adjustment. They were still trying to live down having championed structural adjustment, so they adopted the development goals as something very constructive that they could agree with, that they could promote, and they could help finance.
Yes. Excellent. So maybe not to monopolize my own position here. So maybe to open the floor, I would just ask anyone to not to be shy, just to put the question, introducing him or herself and putting the question, and if the comment comes to make it, let's say, short.
And
so
Anis,
please.
will you choose the questioners?
Yes, I hope they would come with the Zoom. Actually, Zoom will select them. So.
Well, I can look at the participants and see whose hands up. That might be the easiest.
Yes, we can also do that.
So why don't use others on the call? At the bottom of your screen, there's a participant box.
Yes.
You'll see between chat and security.
Yes.
Press it, and you'll see a participants list, and it has all of your names, and you should be able then to, normally you'd be able to put your hand up. So I'm going to see.
Yes, yes. I hope they won't be hesitant on that.
The other thing you could do is put your screen on and just wave at us if you.
Yes, or I think if they switch the mic. So guys, who wants to put the question, you put your mic on and you start talking. And I think Zoom connects automatically, if I'm not mistaken. That should be working with Zoom.
That can work fine
yes,
too.
I think we have.
Robert Lancard.
Yes,
yes, please. We don't see you, but we hear you. Yes, please.
Okay. Good morning. I am Robert Lancard. I call you from Cordoba. I just start to teach with UMEF. You know, I am a former international civil servant from UNWTO. Well, and I am still an expert of the World Bank. And my question is just on the chat. Concerning the Washington consensus, which lead to a more globalized and liberal society, and what is now the UN position? I know that there is a CGD, but you know, do you think that we can apply that differently in another society where we pay careful to inequality and the human rights? Thank you.
Well, it's a very interesting question, Robert. Thank you. I'll give you an indication of how thinking in developing countries has changed, just as thinking in industrialized countries has changed. In the run-up, the immediate run-up to the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, in 2005, there was a conference mainly of finance ministers from all over the world in Addis Ababa. And it was a conference large about how to finance development. It was convened by the African Union and the UN. And finance ministers from all over went. And the people who matter when you're talking about money are not the foreign ministers, believe me. The people who matter are the finance ministers and sometimes central bank governors,
yes,
their officials. And they were largely the participants at this conference in Addis. And they came up with a declaration which was radically different from anything earlier seen at the UN. It was a much more sophisticated document that was adopted under the umbrella of the UN as the Addis Ababa Action Plan that foresaw development not being reliant on one financing stream, but on multiple financing streams. By then, by the way, by 2015, remittances from workers working outside their countries, financial transfers back to their families and others in developing countries were a bigger source of financing, 3 times bigger than official development assistance. So, and this was mentioned, that a range of financing channels would need to be encouraged, supported, made cheaper. For example, the cost of transferring remittances is very high. If you're a worker in Saudi Arabia and you want to transfer money to Pakistan, the fees you pay for the financial transfer can be as high as 10% of the amount you're sending. That's ridiculous today, with the cost of electronic transfer being virtually zero, the real cost. So the truth is that remittances can be further encouraged by working on lowering the cost of the remittance flow. Secondly, obviously, both official and commercial lending can be helpful, but only carefully calculated and carefully targeted lending. Official development assistance, everybody agreed, remained important, but what the Addis Ababa Accord did was yield to the reality that the funding of development was a very widespread, rather mysterious still in some ways, process that involved many funding streams resulting from trade, from financial transfers of all sorts, private, public, involving governments, not involving governments, involving private banks, not involving private banks. International finance has become a much more sophisticated game than it was in 1945. So I think the Addis Ababa outcome, which was welcomed at the UN in 2015, but curiously now being contested by some ambassadors in New York as somehow, well, yes, we adopted it, but we're not sure we agree. That horse is out of the barn. So I'd say it is the document of record that most comprehensively, I'd say, addresses the contemporary scene of financing for development. So anybody really interested in this, I'd urge them to have a look at it. It's available anywhere online.
Excellent.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency. So
I have to add, because as Robert, UN documents seem to be written to be boring and to stupefy the reader within one paragraph. And I'm afraid
David,
that's
don't
the
worry. I wrote
reality.
a lot of this document for UNWTO. I know the process.
Terrible documents. But the substance is interesting. So who next?
Yes. So please use the time. We still have some, let's say 15 minutes. And remember, there is the only stupid question is question you never ask. There is no stupid question. Please.
Excellency?
Yes.
Please.
My name is Sayed Jalal. I am the ex-Afghanistan ambassador to Saudi Arabia. I would like to have your input on one issue which I was personally involved in. We were trying to negotiate a funding contract for one of the United Nations programs in Afghanistan. And during that negotiation, I found out that almost 45% of the total amount of money that was going to be given as a grant by Saudi Arabian government was going for costs. Not implementation of the actual projects.
Indeed.
But yes. So I found I found that to be a very, very high amount, and I actually at that time I refused to accept that amount, and I did not even sign it because I said that during my embassy I would not be able to sign something at 45% of cost. Can you kind of elaborate why is it that the United Nations projects are so costly while the same project can be implemented by local governments at much lesser cost or by other international organizations at much lesser cost?
It's a very good question. First of all, you were so right not to sign it and to find alternative ways of getting the work done. I simply don't know the specifics of the case, and so I can't comment in detail. But what you point to is a universal process of rent-seeking from development. All sorts of actors are looking to fund themselves from development projects. And this is one of the worries also about some bilateral programs. Notably in Africa, worries are beginning to arise over Belt and Road, which isn't particularly non-transparent. It's just a lot of debt has been contracted under the Belt and Road heading. And now with COVID, with all sorts of other factors, including global economic slowdown, actual negative growth in many countries, this debt is a big burden. And so taking on projects, the funding of which is opaque, the processes for renegotiating of which, if circumstances change, are opaque, are very risky for developing countries. But often decision makers in developing countries aren't as brave as you were, Jalal. And in order to get a media headline, because you do get a media headline from signing some agreement that will cause something good to happen, many of them just sign on the dotted line in the hope that their successor will deal with the problems.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maybe two more questions, please. In the meantime,
because I really do have to go in about 6 minutes.
Yeah, so Excellency, since we are also addressing students, the younger generation, so just in a nutshell, so what is the necessary requirement if someone is interested in coming to the UN university?
Well,
I'm sure you would recommend this to everyone.
Well, not to everybody, because actually we have very few students. We have only 5 student programs in our 12 locations. 2 or 3, no, I think only 3 doctoral programs we have, and the rest are master's programs. So we have 5 master's programs and 3 doctoral programs. They're very narrowly gauged. So in Dresden, they focus on integrated management of water, soil, and waste. If you're not interested in that topic, why would you apply to go and study there? The same thing in Maastricht. We have a very good doctoral program, which is on the economics of innovation. Now, what all of these doctoral programs have in common is we select above all applicants from the developing world. And we try to make sure there's financial assistance for the majority of them at least. So it's attractive to students from the developing world.
Okay.
And in a sense, we give them preference also at equal, strength of application. We'll nearly always choose the student from a developing country because we are a UN university and we were created in part in the hope that we would be useful to the developing world.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm sure it will be valuable information for students.
And for any of these programs, go to our website, unu.edu, and you'll find our educational programs and how to apply.
And the guidelines, yeah, who is eligible and how to apply.
So time for one more question. And
yes.
So
maybe,
who's the brave person?
Maybe the closing question. Yes, please.
Be fun to have one last question.
People are, I think, considering what to do.
They are, as the French would say, assumé rather.
Yes. A bit hesitant. But maybe.
A bit hesitant. But anyway, yeah. I really enjoyed.
Yes, if you don't have if you don't have a last question, so what is in your view the outcome out of Corona? So what are, let's say, things that we should take into consideration? I know it's $1 million question.
First of all, something the industrialized countries have to remember amidst their own manifold problems is that the problems of developing countries will be worse. Not necessarily because they suffered worse from Corona. Africa has actually suffered less from Corona than Europe, for reasons we don't fully understand yet, but the damage is worse anyway.
True.
Asia has also suffered less than Europe, but in many countries of Asia, the damage is worse. So when we come out of the pandemic, the industrialized countries and institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, need to remember that the needs of the developing countries will be even greater than the needs of citizens of Canada like myself.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I think it's excellent closing word actually for today's.
You. I was flattered all of you were willing to join us today, and I was grateful to Anis for inviting me.
Thank you, Excellency. Thank you so much.
Don't call me Excellency. When you're an ambassador, you're Excellency for as long as you're an ambassador, and then you're a nobody. So
yes. No, thank you so much for today's lecture. I hope we will have an opportunity to also greet you in Geneva. I know that you come from time to time.
I come from time to time.
Yeah. In normal circumstances that you should be coming from time to time, maybe even this part of the season. So we hope that we will have you at least on Zoom, not before too long, and also physically to host you. Thank you so much. Thanks to all participants. The next speaker will be a hot potato in a way, and this is Professor Varoufakis from Greece.
Oh, terrific! Good for you.
Yes.
I'm sorry to miss it.
We think differently.